Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Poverty of the World, Rediscovering the Poor at Home and Abroad, 1941 to 1968, by Sheyda Jahanbani, narrated by Teri Schnaubelt. Introduction. The World's Problem in Miniature, Global Poverty in the American Century. In 1944, a Swedish economist, largely unknown outside of his home country, published what would soon come to be recognized as a landmark statement about the nature of American democracy. Interrupted only by the Nazi invasion of Denmark and Norway, which compelled him to return to Stockholm, Gunnar Myrdal had spent 5 years writing An American Dilemma, a 2-volume, nearly 1,400-page exposé of the race problem in the United States. Hired by the Carnegie Corporation to undertake what the institution's director, Francis Keppel, called a comprehensive study of the Negro in America, Myrdal instead delivered a stirring call to the conscience of white Americans. They were stuck in a moral dilemma, he explained, torn between living their democratic values in a world desperately in need of them, or preserving the draconian system of white supremacy they had inherited from a bygone age. Escaping this predicament by breaking what he called the vicious cycle of racial discrimination would have profound implications not just for the United States, but for the fate of democracy itself. Yet Myrdal's insights about both the scourge of white supremacy in the United States and the global implications of the American race problem were initially obscured in his mind by the overwhelming material reality of black poverty. Traveling across the South from 1938 to 1940, Myrdal had been appalled by the conditions of black life. Seeking out opportunities to talk to poor Americans across the racial divide, he quickly deduced that the Negro problem was rooted in economic scarcity. "My Negro investigation," he wrote to his mentor, Gustav Cassel, "will be an analysis of the Southern states' miserable economy." This had not been especially novel insight. The same year Myrdal began his research, President Franklin D. Roosevelt's National Emergency Council had produced a report that declared the South the nation's #1 economic problem. But critics charged that the report sidestepped the mutually reinforcing relationship between Southern poverty and the region's culture of segregation and racial violence. Myrdal aimed his attention at exactly that relationship. He concluded that racial discrimination, built so deeply into the foundations of American life, prevented black Americans from seizing the plentiful opportunities for social mobility that industrial capitalism created. Their inability to escape their poverty reinforced and perpetuated the racism that led to their exclusion. These findings made this preternaturally optimistic man despair for the United States. "The Negro problem," he explained, "represents a moral lag in the development of the nation, and a study of it must record nearly everything which is bad and wrong in America." From Sweden in the late spring of 1940, however, the United States and its complex social problems looked very different to Myrdal. As he and his wife and closest professional colleague Alva pushed against the tide of apathy among their fellow Swedes about the dangers of appeasing fascism, they both began to think anew about American democracy. While racism and poverty surely persisted in the United States, as their recent investigation had revealed, the Myrdals came to see the widespread faith most Americans had in the universal values of freedom and equality as more remarkable than the grotesque social and economic inequalities that persisted throughout the country. "The secret," they wrote in their 1940 book, Contact Me America, Contact with America, "is that America, ahead of every other country in the whole Western world, large or small, has a living system of expressed ideals for human cooperation which is unified, stable, and clearly formulated. Every American has them stamped on his consciousness." Moreover, the Myrdals, both avowed social democrats, lauded the achievements of the New Deal as a revolution in American politics that had broken the back of laissez-faire individualism and opened the door to a new era of social equality and democratic flourishing. In a magazine article, Alva predicted that this popular revolution, now unleashed, would only continue to gather strength. "The American people know," she wrote, "that if they are to be ready for world responsibilities, they must strengthen their social defenses by quickly carrying out domestic reforms." Americans might not always live up to their ideals, the Myrdals acknowledged in those anxious wartime days, but most of them at least knew what star they were now aiming toward. The real American dilemma, then, was much larger than the Negro problem. Felt acutely by liberal thinkers like the Myrdals in those years of crisis, it was whether the United States would do what it took to defend democracy from the forces of chauvinism, competition, and exploitation that had led to the Great War, the Great Depression, and now another global conflagration. Americans had the tools, but would they finish the job? If they could overcome white supremacy and the abominable poverty it perpetuated at home, Myrdal wrote, the century-old dream of American patriots that America should give to the entire world its own freedoms and its own faith would come true. Writing as a European after the United States had finally joined the two-front war against fascism and imperialism on the battlefield, he added, with some poignancy, "In the present phase of history, this is what the world needs to believe." That a minutely detailed study of the most peculiar American social problem became, under the pressures of the civilizational challenge posed by fascism, a clarion call for Americans to help the entire world fulfill the promise of capitalist liberal democracy, cannot entirely be explained by the fact that its author left American shores in the middle of his project. To be sure, Myrdal's foreignness helped him make sense of the problem he had been hired to explain. That he was from a country that appeared to have no race problem of its own and had no recent history of colonialism had been among the criteria by which he had been chosen. Making sense of the American race problem in the broader economic and international contexts with which he was concerned had long been Myrdal's aim. And so, as he considered the case before him, he could clearly see that the vicious cycle of exclusion and poverty that he observed in the South was not merely a national phenomenon. In An American Dilemma, Myrdal wrote to Castle in 1940, "I have the world's problem in miniature, the whole aggression complex and the circle of prejudices, violence, and poverty. For the first time I can grasp the full reality of the whole colonial problem." The restlessness of colonized people who had been subjugated and immiserated for centuries at the hands of the world's white minority and their righteous claims for self-determination could not and would not be ignored after the war. Concerned about social and economic justice, convinced of a universalist vision of humanity, and thinking on a scale that transcended the borders of the United States, Myrdal was already anticipating the world the war would leave behind. Integrating Black Americans into the body politic of the United States was necessary to strengthen the country's social defenses in Alva Myrdal's construction. Integrating the world's poor into a global democratic order was the much greater challenge. Myrdal thus made a telling and significant intellectual shift. He turned his gaze toward the problem that he believed was the most urgent one facing the post-war world, the challenge of what he came to call world poverty. Myrdal's intellectual journey from studying American racism and its economic dimensions to recognizing the global significance of American democracy, and then to settling on world poverty as the preeminent problem of the 20th century, was neither natural nor inevitable. Myrdal and the other liberal thinkers whose stories The Poverty of the World tells spent the decades between the 1930s and the 1960s constructing this problem. Charting its economic, social, political, cultural, even psychological dimensions, these figures reimagined the problem of poverty across a global canvas. They developed strategies to solve it, and they worked to generate the political will necessary for the United States to take on the responsibility for doing so. Elevating world poverty to the pinnacle of American policymaking, they even declared a global war on it. In this story of Gunnar Myrdal's movement toward the problem of world poverty as the signal challenge of the post-war world, a much broader and deeper phenomenon comes into view. Amid the wreckage of World War II, a generation of left-leaning intellectuals gained a new awareness of the place of the United States in the world and the relationship between America's domestic social problems and the fate of democracy across the globe. Their perspective, forged in the crucible of the Great Depression, these thinkers saw the relationship between unrestrained capitalism and political extremism with startling clarity. Economic inequality bred social disorder, and social disorder threatened the democratic political order. In the form of the New Deal, they believed, the United States had finally tamed the beast of industrial capitalism and undertaken the social and economic advances necessary to expand prosperity to all. In doing so, the New Deal reconstructed American democracy for the modern age. As the war reached its final chapter, these thinkers believed that the United States had to take up its sacred responsibility, its epical opportunity, to both strengthen its social defenses at home and remake the world in its image, prosperous, egalitarian, and democratic. The spread of the Soviet Empire concurrent with the titanic revolution of decolonization in the global South only made this undertaking more urgent. Attacking the problem of world poverty, the task to which Myrtle devoted the rest of his long life, became their mission. The discourse on poverty fighting, to which Myrtle contributed after 1944, informed a distinctly liberal vision of U.S. hegemony in the years between the World War II and the U.S. war in Vietnam. A long-standing project for American liberals, poverty fighting promised to make the world more prosperous and more peaceful. It was also a gift that they thought the United States, as the world's richest and most egalitarian country, had the unique capacity to give, rationalizing the reconstruction of American hegemony on universal humanitarian principles. As American liberals took on the challenge of combating poverty around the world, the logic of poverty fighting became the foundation of a new vision of American empire, an empire that shared its economic and technical resources, its expert knowledge and democratic values, its ability to transcend sectional, class, and even racial divisions with mass prosperity. Poverty fighting offered a conception of empire in which imperial power was measured by what an empire could give rather than what it had the capacity to take. That the United States owed the world its leadership and its humanitarian assistance after the war was not, of course, just a liberal position. Even the publishing magnate Henry Luce, whose political ideology was anything but liberal, declared in his 1941 essay, The American Century, that the United States had to become the Good Samaritan of the entire world. But for the poverty-fighting liberals this book profiles, this challenge was not merely one of many facing the United States in its global leadership. It was the justification for and the legitimizing force of U.S. empire. Fighting poverty around the world was a way for them to globalize what they saw as the foundational achievement of American liberalism itself. The Poverty of the World explores the strategies and tactics of the global war on poverty that America fought between the 1930s and 1960s. This global war sent thousands of American poverty fighters out across the globe to isolate and treat the condition. It generated enormous demand for expertise in scholarly disciplines ranging from economics to anthropology, giving rise to new academic programs at American universities, and inspiring their establishment of non-governmental organizations to collect data and implement solutions. And every part of the world was touched by it, including America's own inner cities and rural hinterlands. From progressive-era experiments to attack immigrant poverty in the settlement houses of New York City in the 1910s, to the new frontier development programs across the global South in the 1960s, poverty fighting became an American industry, one whose export captured the imagination of intellectuals, policymakers, and ordinary citizens from Berkeley to Boston and all the points in between. Washington became not only the home of the Pentagon, but also the headquarters of the Peace Corps. In the process, the global war on poverty provided a way for Americans to make sense of their country's power, to reframe its limits, and to isolate and attack an enemy that transcended any nation-state. The protagonists of this book are a small but influential cast of liberal intellectuals and policymakers. John Collier, Oscar Lewis, John Kenneth Galbraith, Arthur Schlesinger Jr., Michael Harrington, and Sargent Shriver are among them. What ties each of these characters together is that they identified on the left liberal spectrum of American political life, defined poverty as a central concern facing the United States and the world, opposed militarism as a method of maintaining American hegemony, and used their expertise and cultural capital to exert as much authority as they could over the commanding heights of policymaking. These were the most prominent members of a larger community who believed that poverty was the most urgent threat facing a democratic world order, and that the United States was uniquely capable of launching a global war against it. They researched and wrote about poverty explicitly to awaken middle-class Americans to the problem, and they lobbied for and implemented strategies to win that war at the highest levels of U.S. government. But they were not the only ones. The Poverty of the World also excavates the efforts of a lesser-known but no less important network of men and women whose ideas and activism fueled this undertaking in profound ways. Through the intertwined stories of these figures, this book traces a number of broader historical developments: the rise of humanitarianism in facilitating and justifying U.S. hegemony to those who were most skeptical of the use of military power, the growing connections between domestic and international social policy, the tightening nexus between knowledge production and government policymaking, and the proliferation representations of global poverty fighting as a distinctly American responsibility. A glance at the passports of the men and women who conceived, designed, and implemented the global war on poverty reveals one more common thread. Discovering the poverty of the world was an act of the transnational imagination. Travel has long been central to the project of liberal reform. In the late 19th century, Protestant missionaries and other moral reformers had fanned out across the globe to spread Christian moral empire. Progressive-era reformers traveled extensively too, meeting their counterparts abroad, establishing networks for the transnational flow of ideas, bringing home key insights, creating, in short, what historian Daniel Rogers calls a transatlantic social politics. New Dealers also took to the roads and airways to find models as well as allies in their attempt to revive liberal capitalism and fend off reactionary politics. The generation of liberal poverty fighters, whose stories this book tells, inherited this tradition of mobility and, mostly owing to the exigencies of total war, expanded upon it. From Collier to Lewis, Galbraith to Shriver, these reformers built relationships with intellectuals and policymakers throughout the rest of the world during and after World War II, explicitly in pursuit of shared solutions to problems that seemed to rise above any one national context. Some of them went abroad in search of knowledge about poverty. Some discovered poverty anew during their travels. Their journeys, neither limited nor always linear, these men and women circulated in and out of the United States as a matter of routine, becoming part of a transnational flow of ideas that fundamentally informed the way they thought about poverty as a social problem. Indeed, the poverty-fighting liberals about whom I write came to understand world poverty through what they saw as first-hand encounters with it. The origins of the global war on poverty are to be found in the early 20th century. A response to the influx of European immigrants to American cities and to the externalities of industrial capitalism, progressive-era reformers began to draw on the nascent social sciences to collect data and design programs to address the plight of the other half. The Great Depression turned poverty from the specific condition of some into a general experience for many. And during the New Deal, poverty experts turned that crisis into opportunity. Social workers like Frances Perkins designed Social Security, and Harry Hopkins stood up to the Federal Emergency Relief Administration. John Collier used the moment to rethink the place of America's first colonized peoples, and transformed the Bureau of Indian Affairs into an anti-poverty agency. As depression gave way to war and the New Deal became a permanent fixture in American life, poverty fighting shifted from a domestic emergency to a national security strategy. In the 1940s and 1950s, as World War II mutated into the Cold War, poverty fighting as a defensive maneuver against the Soviet Union gained wider traction. Liberals like John Kenneth Galbraith and Arthur Schlesinger endeavored to counter the militaristic argument made by Cold War hawks with a humanitarian vision trained on what they believed was the root cause of social revolution: poverty. Decolonization accelerated the demand for new ideas about what the United States might have to offer the millions of people who had been impoverished by European imperialism. Foreign aid programs, from the Marshall Plan to the Point-4 program, put material resources behind that humanitarian vision. Red-baited on the right and charged with hypocrisy from the left, the advocates of a global war on poverty also achieved a modus vivendi with those who insisted upon military containment. They were, they thought, playing the long game, in which the strategy of poverty fighting would ultimately outmaneuver that of armed force. By the 1960s, the global war on poverty went from blueprint to model, reaching the heights of policymaking in both the Kennedy and Johnson administrations. Social movements for civil rights and economic justice at home gained ground at the same time, prompting Lyndon B. Johnson to open a domestic front in the global war on poverty. This coincided with the war he intensified in South Vietnam, ultimately undoing his ambitious plans for an international Great Society altogether. Within a decade of gaining the high ground, the global war on poverty had gone into retreat on both the domestic and foreign fronts, leaving non-governmental organizations and private corporations to pick up the pieces. By the 1980s, this paradigmatic liberal mission had been dismissed as a fool's errand, with President Ronald Reagan declaring that, "In the 60s we waged war on poverty, and poverty won." The story of how American liberals reimagined poverty on a global scale and designed and implemented a global war to eradicate it brings together histories of poverty, development, liberalism, and Cold War-era U.S. foreign and domestic policies. The Poverty of the World makes 3 claims. The book argues that, for liberals, poverty was reborn as a global phenomenon in the years after World War II, in no small part because of the immense contrast between a poor world and an affluent America. Further, it asserts that the development discourse, especially the concept of underdevelopment that emerged in the 1940s, provided the intellectual building blocks of their concept of global poverty. Finally, it contends that in the years between 1945 and 1968, liberal political elites advanced an alternative vision of an empire of affluence to contest the strategic one that the United States pursued. Some of the evidence for these bold claims about the centrality of poverty fighting to the post-war American project comes from a rather quotidian historical observation. Poverty, as a social problem, occupied an outsized place in the imaginations of Americans in the years between 1945 and 1980. Indeed, according to Google Ngram, Americans and fellow travelers from abroad like Murdahl spilled more ink on the topic of poverty during those years than at any time before or since. What makes this especially strange is that all of this poverty talk coincided not with a period of economic crisis and social unrest, but with an era of unprecedented American affluence and social mobility. In his synthesis of anti-poverty efforts in American history, historian James Patterson notes this odd fact, writing that, "It is much easier to observe that poverty became a subject of debate than to explain why." One explanation is surely that poverty as a concern had long been the exclusive domain of liberalism, and that liberalism reached the zenith of its power in American politics during this era. While the poor have been a target of moral uplift in the Anglo-American tradition dating back to the 1600s, It was only in the middle of the 19th century that poverty became what historian Alice O'Connor calls an objective, quantifiable condition. Between the 1870s and the beginning of World War I, a newly emboldened middle class of liberal reformers promoted the idea that poverty was a problem that transcended the moral failings of the individual poor, and that empirical research guided by expert knowledge could yield solutions to this socially destabilizing phenomenon. Part of a transnational network, progressives saw poverty as one aspect of a much larger economic transformation in modern life, one that was riven with periods of acute crisis, as well as the potential for previously unimaginable growth. Unwilling to trust Adam Smith's invisible hand, they sought to make poverty in the industrial city visible and quantifiable, and from the map to the survey, they set about creating a body of knowledge that could serve as a springboard for intervention. Even during the Great Depression, a staggering economic crisis that substantiated the warnings many of their predecessors had been sounding about the dangers of laissez-faire capitalism since the 1870s, liberal reformers remained attentive to poverty as a distinct social and cultural problem and worked to study and quantify it. Indeed, helping the poor, as the liberal political commentator Kevin Drum observed in 2014, has always been one of the great causes of liberalism. Yet, after 1945, poverty became more than a discrete domestic social problem for liberals. It became a way to make sense of the staggering reversal of global economic fortunes that had been triggered by the war. By 1945, an American economy that had been brought to its knees just a few years earlier had passed through the crucible of industrial collapse to produce the greatest concentration of national wealth that the world had ever known. As year zero of this new age dawned, a country where 1 out of every 4 men had been unemployed just a few years earlier was the world's economic powerhouse. To be sure, the United States had attained that status earlier in the century by financing and supplying World War I, and the 1920s had been a period of glittering affluence at home. But America, in 1945, was more than just a powerful economy. It was the world's economic superpower. It possessed 2/3 of the world's gold reserves, 3/4 of its invested capital, half of the world's supply of shipping, and more than half of its manufacturing capacity. 1 out of every 3 goods constructed by man or machine on the planet Earth in 1945 was made on American soil. Its home front relatively unscathed, the United States possessed some 500,000 miles of surfaced roads and 250,000 miles of railway track on which to transport people and things. It had laboring men aplenty, too. While 16 million able-bodied Americans served in uniform, less than 0.4% of the U.S. population had lost their lives in war. Millions and millions more had kept factories humming, tractors tilling, and cash registers ringing. The arsenal of democracy was now the world's storehouse. While the war filled the treasure chest of the United States to brimming, it pilfered those of almost every other nation-state in the world. Europe's capital and labor had been utterly decimated. From the Azores to the Urals, almost every city, town, and village bore the deep scars of aerial bombardment. The once mighty industrial hubs of France, England, and Germany lay shattered, with their once enviable railway lines, roads, bridges, and canals mostly blown to smithereens. Of course, transportation networks only mattered to countries that possessed conveyances that could travel across them. Europe had few such vehicles in 1945. France lost 2/3 of its merchant marine fleet and 9,200 of its 12,000 locomotives during the German occupation and Allied liberation. Even in neutral countries, war impoverished Europeans. The war robbed Europe of much more than industrial plant and transportation networks. It stole the lifeblood of its economic strength, its people. Some 36.5 million Europeans died as a result of the war, a number equal to the entire population of pre-war France. In Germany, 2 out of every 3 men born in 1918 did not live to see VE Day. For those who managed to survive, hunger and sickness waited around the corner, as did crippling uncertainty. Few Europeans could be certain of finding.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?